In the past, the name Richard Gere was always linked to easy charm. That man who made the whole screen stop even though he didn't say much. In the movie American Gigolo, he moved through screens like he was really there. He showed the world through Pretty Woman that love and kindness could change any bias. Richard Gere used to be the romantic, calm, and deep face of a whole age. After that, he was gone. Richard Gere was no longer in blockbuster movies, wasn't nominated for any Oscars, and didn't play a major part in any movies that were popular around the world. Hollywood, the place that made him famous, suddenly went quiet, as if he had never existed. Many people thought he was past his best, that he was too old, too hard to work with, or just not cool enough for today's tastes. Yes, but that's only the beginning. It hides other stories, like an artist who stood up for what was right even if it meant stepping away from the stage, a politically strong stance that caused 15 years of problems, and a kiss that seemed harmless but caused a lot of trouble. What did really happen? What took a famous person off the main stage? No one can give a clear answer. We only know that Richard Gere did and didn't do some things that made people stop talking about him in places where he used to be praised. It could have been a choice. It could have been a bad thing. No matter what it was, the story wasn't and still isn't easy. Richard Gere did more than just show up on TV and in movies in the 1980s and 1990s. He became a part of the cultural memory of a whole generation. He had a different kind of charm that drew people in when he wasn't making noise or trying to stand out. They had eyes that told a story, a stance that didn't need to be explained, and a slow, controlled voice that made it sound like every word had been carefully thought out before it was spoken. It's not true that Richard Gere was too good-looking. He looked good in real life. A man who had lived, loved, lost, and held his pain without speaking. In 1980's American Gigolo, his character Julian was a quiet hit to the American society's front. Julian was cool, seductive, and broken. And in the 1990 movie Pretty Woman, Gere, dressed in a gray suit and smiling quietly, won hearts all over the world by loving a prostitute with all the kindness a hurt man could offer. He didn't want to play loud action roles or be a part of superhero series or movies that were sure to do well at the box office. The parts Richard Gere chose always seemed to have a lot of depth, conflict, and moral questions. Fear at its base, cheating, Autumn in New York, and The Fake. All of them had something in common. The major roles were never easy, and Richard Gere never played them. He lived with them. Hollywood needed Richard Gere for a while, and not just because of his name. He was a type of man that you don't see on screen very often these days. Older, has a history, and isn't afraid of silence. Something felt more real, slower, and deeper when he came into the picture. But that golden light, no matter how bright it was, couldn't escape the times or the forces outside the screen. Richard Gere worked hard behind the scenes, but as he got older and worked in an industry that values youth, speed, and profit, his appearance on the big screen became more noticeable but less loud. He kept acting and picking parts that were deep and thought-provoking, with few words but a lot of meaning. But that was no longer what Hollywood wanted. Now that there are superhero movies, series hits, and a global audience of people under 30, Richard Gere, with his silver hair, serious eyes, and slow walk, became hard to sell. From the late 1990s to the mid-2000s and into his teens, he was in a lot of movies, but most of them didn't do well at the box office or get much attention. The 1994 movie Intersection got bad reviews. King David, 1985, was an attempt gone wrong that turned out to be one of his worst movies ever. Even though The Jackal, 1997, did better at the box office, it was still seen as an average action movie. Amelia, 2009, a biopic that had a $40 million budget but made less than $20 million, was the worst. Both reviewers and audiences didn't like it. Even Nights in Rodanthe, 2008, which tried to bring back Gere's loving image with Diane Lane, didn't do very well. People thought it was boring and out of date, and even though it made over $40 million in the US, it didn't do nearly as well as other movies based on Nicholas Sparks' books, like The Notebook or Dear John. For producers, Richard Gere was a risky star because he wasn't a sure thing at the box office, he wasn't appealing to younger viewers, and he didn't fit with the new blockbuster formula. In the eyes of producers trying to make money in the global market, especially China, Gere was quietly taken off of hiring lists because he was no longer making money. At the same time, Hollywood entered the most prestigious era of TV. Some actors who used to be big stars in movies, like Glenn Close, Kevin Spacey, and Bryan Cranston, changed their looks in well-made TV movies, but Richard Gere didn't follow suit. It could be by choice. Maybe because he wasn't asked to come. He was still Richard Gere, but not the Richard Gere of today. He didn't want to go back to anywhere, not even Broadway, where he had made a great start. Gere stayed away from theater for over 30 years, even though he was praised for Bent and made a mark on stage. No TV, no theater, no hits, no franchises, and no Marvel, DC, Star Wars, or any other movie universes. As the world became more and more alike, Richard Gere stood out in a way that was not welcome. No one said they had forgotten about him, but no one talked about him either. That being said, it would be wrong to think that Richard Gere disappeared because of bad movies or aged. Hollywood crossed out his name for another reason, not because he was no longer a good fit. He was brave enough to say something Hollywood didn't want to hear. It was never official from Hollywood that Richard Gere was guilty. But people who work in the movie business know that he crossed a line that could not be crossed back. Richard Gere spoke at the 1993 Oscars on Hollywood's most prestigious stage. Instead of saying thank you, as most people do, he openly criticized the Chinese government, fought for the freedom of the Tibetan people, and asked the world not to ignore what he called horrendous human rights violations. The whole theater froze. The media were split. From then on, he was on the unofficial blacklist of the industry, even though he was a famous actor, had been a Buddhist since he was 20, and was close with the Dalai Lama. This happened at a time when Hollywood was becoming more and more dependent on the Chinese market. Soon after, he played the lead role in Red Corner, 1997, a movie about how harsh the Chinese justice system is. It was against the law in mainland China. What was scarier, though, was this. Hollywood also started to quietly ban him. Studios knew the rules, but no one said it out loud. There is a very good chance that a movie with Richard Gere in it would not be allowed to be shown in China, where the market is growing very quickly. With the ability to make more money at the box office than the US. It cost more than money to have a movie banned. It put at risk the complicated web of interests and connections between studios and the Chinese government. Someone warned a Chinese director who was once hired to work on a project with Richard Gere. That was it. He and his family would never be able to leave the country again, and he would never be able to work again. McGeer told this story with a strangely calm tone, as if he was already okay with having his name crossed out, which he was. No longer were there casting calls or scripts for big movies. Also, the Oscars, where he used to stand, speak, and shock everyone, were close to him for almost 20 years. It wasn't because he was smart or old, it was because he wouldn't keep quiet. Richard Gere wasn't good at finding middle ground, even though Hollywood was becoming more and more willing to do so. No, not with producers, directors, or leaders, and most of all, not with himself. It wasn't what they gave up. He might have thought it was just regularity. However, Hollywood didn't like it. It was dangerous. Something that the system couldn't take in. India, a country he had long cared about because of his faith and charity work, turned its back on him because of a kiss he gave in the wrong place and at the wrong time. Hollywood turned its back on him because of politics. In March 2007, Richard Gere was the guest of honor at a charity event in New Delhi to raise awareness about HIV/AIDS. While standing next to famous actress Shilpa Shetty on stage, Gere suddenly embraced her tightly, kissed her on the cheek several times, and imitated a love movie gesture. Shetty laughed awkwardly, and people around them looked at them in shock. A few hours later, though, the pictures were all over the front pages of newspapers in India. In a society that is very strict about public behavior, even holding hands can be seen as going too far. This show of affection by a Western guy toward a local cultural icon during the day and in front of cameras was seen as completely unacceptable. The public was furious. At protests, extremist groups burned Gere-shaped effigies in a number of towns. A person in the area charged both Gere and Shetty with public profanity, breaking social norms, and bringing shame on the community. The court in Jaipur not only agreed with the case, but it also ordered that both Gere and Shetty be arrested. In the indictment, the kiss was called "beyond all limits of vulgarity." Gere left India right away. Even though Shetty was clearly the inactive one, he still had to go to court. She stood up for herself. I know it's not our culture, but his. But I didn't see anything wrong or sexual that would have made you respond this way. It wasn't enough. The people wouldn't forgive. After that, the case just kept going on. No trial, no getting fired. After more than 10 years, it hung over both of their names like a heavy cloud. A last-minute kiss on a charity stage had become a dark mark on culture. This makes Gere a bother not only in China but also in one of Asia's film markets that is growing the fastest. In 2022, 15 years later, the case was finally ended by the court in Mumbai, who found Shetty not guilty because she had no other choice. You never saw Gere in court, and he never went back to India either. Some might say it was just a mistaken culture, a misunderstanding, or an exaggeration by everyone. But when looked at from a different angle, it showed this truth. In a time when everything can be sped up, an artist who steps into a new cultural area without fully understanding its invisible limits could lose their global career. Richard Gere wasn't hurt by that kiss. But it made the man's image even worse. Hollywood and Asia both had a hard time accepting him, though for very different reasons. After everything, Richard Gere didn't run away, but he also didn't follow. There were no complaints or answers. He just moved out of the way and went his own way. He turned to independent films because big companies were no longer an option for him. There, spreadsheets and market tastes couldn't tell him what to do with his art. The films Arbitrage, 2012, Norman, 2016, The Benefactor, 2015, and The Dinner, 2017, are all quiet, slow, and personal. They were not made for the people. But he gave some of his best efforts ever in those roles. The New York Times once said that Norman was the best role he had ever played. Newsweek said that Richard Gere's role in The Dinner was part of an impressive comeback in independent films. But there were no Oscar nods, no lists of the top movies at the box office, and no big red carpets. No one else but him and his characters. Richard Gere knew that, and he thought it was a fair price to pay. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, he made it clear that he doesn't want to be a part of the rush in Hollywood towards streaming, repeats, reboots, and superheroes. He doesn't do it out of anger, but because he doesn't fit there. He doesn't play in movies that are sure to go viral, go on late-night talk shows, or make social media accounts to stay active. He doesn't have to be everywhere because he has never thought that being there is the same as existing. In his 70s, Gere decides to live his life like the roles he's played. He is honest, loyal, and strong enough to handle being forgotten as long as he sticks to what he thinks is right. The movie business doesn't need to know who he is. And maybe Hollywood is glad they don't have to deal with someone like him anymore. Someone who messes up the system's smooth surface by being honest. Not many people in Hollywood live like Richard Gere does. Also, very few who dare to. Richard Gere became a Buddhist in his 20s as a spiritual path, not just as a style like a lot of other famous people do. He didn't learn how to talk. He learned how to listen. The Dalai Lama lives in exile in Dharamsala, a hilly town in northern India. It was there that he learned something that Hollywood could never teach him: being still. Soon after that, Richard Gere became one of the first Americans to become friends with the Dalai Lama. Not a public relations friendship, but a real one based on faith, communication, and devotion. He helped start the non-profit Tibet House and then the Gere Foundation, which supports work for human rights, medical aid, protecting indigenous people, raising knowledge about HIV/AIDS, and fighting discrimination. He was also at the HIV awareness event in India in 2007 because of this. There, just one kiss made him a target. But anyone who thought that scandal would make him give up on his goal didn't know Richard Gere. He kept going. He never said sorry for what he believed in, and he never used his faith to build his brand or for publicity purposes. A lot of people in Hollywood put up signs that say what they believe, just to talk about them while you're away. But Gere lives his every day. He does not believe in Buddhism. It changes the way he lives, acts, and sees the world. When he stood in front of the U.S. When Congress asked him to talk about human rights in China, he didn't back down. He said no when big companies asked him to keep quiet in exchange for global projects. As his fame slowly faded, he decided to keep meditating instead of going back to the things he had already risen above. He wasn't forced to live this way. Richard Gere, on the other hand, consistently chose a difficult road because he couldn't live any other way. With his silver hair, meditative look, and unwavering faith, Richard Gere became an inconvenience in a movie world where global tastes were becoming more and more similar. People didn't bend down to forgive him or remember him. He spoke up when no one else did. And he took a step back. Not because he had lost, but because he didn't want to fight for something he didn't believe in anymore. And in some way, his silence is what makes us pay attention. That makes us wonder. People are always being told to be careful and keep quiet in order to stay alive. How many people still have the guts to stand up for what they believe in, even when no one else does? Richard Gere is not trying to be petty. We might not dare to ask out loud what it is about him that makes us think, what is the difference between living right and just getting by? Which one do you want? Have you liked Richard Gere before? Tell us what you think below. Why do you think he was kicked out? Would you be brave enough to do the same thing if you were him? Follow our channel to make sure you don't miss any more powerful stories about the myths you used to love.